The rain drummed against the garden shed's tin roof as I sat on an overturned milk crate, watching through the grimy window as my daughter-in-law Melissa commanded her birthday party like a general directing troops. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here, I was, relegated to the tool shed like unwanted garden equipment, while she celebrated in the house I'd secretly purchased for my son David 3 years ago. "Dad, I'm really sorry about this," David had whispered earlier, his eyes not quite meeting mine as Melissa orchestrated the pre-party setup. "You know how she gets about her special occasions? Maybe it's better if you just stay out of the way tonight?" Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Stay out of the way. At 72 years old, I was being asked to make myself invisible in what was technically my own property. The property deed, carefully hidden through a maze of shell companies and trust funds, bore my signature as the ultimate owner. But to everyone in this neighborhood, including my own son, I was just Harold Jenkins, the retired widower who lived in the modest ranch house at the end of Maple Street. The truth was far more complex. 45 years ago, I'd started Jenkins, development group with nothing but a pickup truck and an unshakable belief that this sleepy suburb would one day become prime real estate. I'd been right. What had once been farmland and empty lots was now Willowbrook Estates, one of the most desirable neighborhoods in the county. And every single house, every street, every carefully planned green space, I owned it all. Through the shed window, I watched Melissa direct the catering staff with theatrical gestures, her voice carrying across the perfectly manicured lawn. No, the champagne fountain goes by the French doors, not the patio. And those flowers are completely wrong. I specifically requested peonies, not hydrangeas." The caterer, a patient woman in her 50s, nodded apologetically while making notes. I recognized her, Elena Rodriguez from Bellacourt Catering. Her company had the exclusive contract for all events in Willowbrook Estates, a decision I'd made. Through my property management company 2 years ago, Elena did exceptional work, but she didn't deserve Melissa's condescending treatment. "And make sure the ice sculpture is visible from every angle," Melissa continued, adjusting her designer dress for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. "This party needs to be Instagram perfect. The Hendersons are still talking about their anniversary celebration, and I refuse to be upstaged." The Hendersons. They lived in the Tudor Revival at 42 Maple Street, another property I owned, another mortgage I held through my subsidiary companies. In fact, as I sat in this cramped shed surrounded by rakes and lawn fertilizer, I was the landlord to every single one of Melissa's guests. My phone buzzed with a text from Margaret Chen, my property manager and one of the few people who knew my true identity. "Quarterly reports ready for review. Several interesting developments regarding Maple Street properties." I typed back quickly. "Will review tomorrow morning. Currently indisposed." If Margaret knew where I was sitting right now, she'd probably suggest I have my competency evaluated. Here I was, a man worth more than most small countries' GDP, hiding in a garden shed because my daughter-in-law had deemed my presence inconvenient for her social media debut. The transformation of Melissa Hartwell into Mrs. David Jenkins had been gradual but unmistakable. When David first introduced her 4 years ago, she'd been charming if a bit materialistic. But marriage and the move to Willowbrook Estates had unleashed something I hadn't anticipated, a social climber with champagne tastes and an appetite for status that seemed to grow with each passing month. Through my network of property managers, maintenance supervisors, and service providers, I'd watched her evolution with growing concern. The complaints about noise from her parties, the demands for premium upgrades to her house, the way she spoke to the cleaning crew, the gardeners, the delivery personnel, all employees of companies I either owned or had significant influence over. But tonight felt different. Tonight she'd crossed a line that she didn't even know existed. "Harold!" Melissa's voice cut through the evening air like a blade. She was standing at the shed door, her perfect smile not quite reaching her eyes. "I hope you're comfortable in there. The party should wrap up by midnight, maybe 1 a.m. at the latest." I looked at my watch. It was barely 7 o'clock. "I brought you some snacks," she continued, setting down a paper plate with what appeared to be leftover appetizers from the preparation. "The good stuff is for the guests, obviously, but this should tide you over." The plate contained 3 sad-looking crackers, a chunk of cheese that was clearly starting to turn, and some grapes that had seen better days. I stared at it, then at her, then back at the plate. "Melissa," I said carefully, "I live here too. This is David's home and—" "Actually," she interrupted, her voice taking on that particular tone she used when correcting what she perceived as inferior thinking. "This is our home now. David and I discussed it, and we both feel it's time for you to start thinking about other arrangements. Maybe a nice retirement community? I've heard good things about Sunset Manor." Sunset Manor. The budget-assisted living facility 20 miles away, known for its basic amenities and waiting lists. The place where people went when their families wanted them out of sight and out of mind. "I see," I said, setting the pathetic plate aside. "And when exactly did David and you have this discussion?" Her smile widened, but her eyes remained cold. "We're both concerned about your situation. Living in your son's house at your age, not contributing to the household expenses. It's becoming awkward, Harold, especially when we have guests over. Not contributing to household expenses." The woman was standing on property I owned, breathing air conditioned by systems I'd paid for, criticizing me for not contributing while every utility bill, every maintenance cost, every improvement to this house ultimately flowed through my accounts. "Tonight is important for us," she continued, checking her reflection in the shed's mirror, a mirror I'd installed last year when David mentioned needing storage space for his tools. "I'm finally going to be accepted into the Willowbrook Wives Club. Do you know how exclusive that is? Mrs. Patterson herself will be here, and she's never attended a party on Maple Street before. Mrs. Patterson, Victoria Patterson, the self-appointed queen of Willowbrook Estates' social hierarchy. She lived in the colonial mansion at 15 Oak Ridge Drive, my most expensive property in the development, with a monthly rent that could fund a small startup. Victoria had no idea that her imperious attitude toward lesser residents was being directed at her actual landlord. I can't have you wandering around, Harold. Not with these people here. You understand, don't you?" The rain had stopped, and through the window I could see guests beginning to arrive. Luxury cars pulled into the circular driveway, a driveway I'd specifically designed to accommodate exactly this kind of entertainment. BMW sedans, Mercedes SUVs, a Tesla Model S, and what appeared to be a Bentley. Each car represented a household I knew intimately through property records, mortgage documents, and monthly rent payments. The Bentley belonged to Richard Ashworth, the investment banker who lived in the Georgian Colonial at 28 Maple Street. He was also 3 months behind on his rent, a fact I'd been discreetly ignoring until now. "I'll stay in the shed," I said, quietly, watching Melissa's face light up with relief and triumph. "Oh, wonderful. I knew you'd understand. You're such a good sport about these things." She patted my shoulder with the kind of patronizing affection usually reserved for well-behaved pets. "There's a lovely romance novel on the shelf there, Sunset Passion, or something equally appropriate for your demographic. Should keep you entertained." She click-clacked away on her designer heels, leaving me alone with the scent of fertilizer and the distant sound of increasingly animated conversation from the house. Through the window, I watched her greet her guests with theatrical air kisses and melodic laughter, playing the role of gracious hostess in a house she believed belonged to her husband. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Margaret Chen's number. But instead of calling, I opened my secure email application, the one connected to the Jenkins Development Group server, and began typing a message that would change everything. "Margaret," I wrote, "I need you to pull the complete files on all Maple Street properties. Every lease agreement, every mortgage document, every service contract. Also, compile a list of all violations of HOA regulations, noise complaints, and unauthorized property modifications for the past year. Priority: 127 Maple Street and all associated residents. On Maple Street, my son's address. The address where I was currently being treated like an unwanted houseguest in my own property. Before sending the email, I paused and looked around the garden shed. It was actually quite comfortable. I'd made sure of that when I'd had it built. Climate-controlled, properly insulated, with electrical outlets and even a small refrigerator for David's convenience. What Melissa didn't know was that this shed had cost more to construct and outfit than most people's cars. The irony was delicious, in a bitter sort of way. She'd exiled me to luxury accommodations while believing she was punishing me with squalor. I sent the email and settled back on the milk crate to watch the party unfold. Through the window, I could see Victoria Patterson making her grand entrance, wearing what appeared to be a vintage Chanel suit and carrying herself with the bearing of someone who believed their presence was a gift to lesser mortals. She had no idea she was standing in my house, on my land, criticizing tenants whose rent checks ultimately made their way to my accounts. My phone buzzed. Margaret's response was characteristically swift. Files being compiled now. Should I also pull the HOA enforcement records and pending lease renewals? Several interesting situations developing. Yes, I typed back. And Margaret, clear my calendar. For tomorrow, I think it's time for some long overdue property inspections. The party was hitting its stride now. I could hear Melissa's laughter carrying across the yard, punctuated by the clink of champagne glasses and the murmur of what she probably considered sophisticated conversation. Someone had turned on music, jazz standards that I recognized from my own carefully curated playlist for neighborhood gatherings. A movement caught my eye, and I saw David approaching the shed. My son looked uncomfortable, glancing back at the house before knocking softly on the door. "Dad, can I come in?" I opened the door, noting the way he fidgeted with his tie. The silk tie I'd given him for his last birthday, purchased from a boutique in Manhattan during one of my quarterly business trips. "I feel terrible about this," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Melissa just gets so stressed about these social things. You know how important it is to her to fit in here." Fit in? My son was apologizing for his wife's behavior while she played. Hostess in a house I owned, surrounded by guests who were ultimately my tenants, eating food prepared by my contracted caterers. "It's fine, David," I said, though we both knew it wasn't. "Tell me about these friends of hers. Interesting group." David's face brightened slightly. He always enjoyed talking about the neighbors, blissfully unaware of my intimate knowledge of each household's financial situation. "Oh, they're amazing people, Dad. Really successful. Victoria Patterson used to work on Wall Street before she married Harold. I mean, the other Harold Patterson. And the Ashworths just got back from a month in the Hamptons." The Hamptons. I happened to know that Richard Ashworth had financed that trip by taking a second mortgage on his Willowbrook property, a mortgage that was ultimately held by one of my subsidiary companies. His month of luxury was being subsidized by loans secured against real estate I owned. "And Melissa's really hoping to get into their wives' club," David continued. "It's incredibly exclusive. They only meet once a month, but it's the social event that matters around here." The Willowbrook Wives Club. I'd heard about it from various sources: property managers who'd fielded complaints about their meetings, service providers who'd been hired for their events, neighbors who'd been deliberately excluded from their social circle. What my son didn't know was that I'd been tracking their activities for months, particularly their habit of using common areas and clubhouse facilities without proper reservations or payments. "That sounds important," I said carefully. "I hope it works out for her." David shifted uncomfortably. "Dad, there's something else. Melissa and I have been talking and, well, We think maybe it might be time for you to consider finding your own place. There it was, the conversation I'd been dreading and expecting in equal measure. I see. And what brought this on? It's not personal, Dad. You know we love having you around. But Melissa feels like maybe you'd be happier somewhere with people your own age. And honestly, we're thinking about starting a family soon, and we'll need the space. Starting a family. In the house I'd purchased for them, with no idea that their children's grandfather owned every square foot of their neighborhood. Have you looked into any specific places? I asked, curious about how far they'd taken this planning. Well, there's Sunset Manor, but the waiting list is pretty long. Or maybe something smaller, like a nice apartment. There are some good senior complexes about 30 minutes away. 30 minutes away from the neighborhood I'd spent 4 decades building, from the community I'd carefully planned and nurtured from empty farmland into one of the most desirable addresses in the county. I'll think about it, I said, and David's relief was visible. Thanks, Dad. You're the best. And hey, maybe this is actually a good thing? New adventures and all that? New adventures. At 72, after building an empire from nothing, my son was suggesting I needed new adventures that didn't inconvenience his wife's social aspirations. After David returned to the party, I sat, in the gathering darkness of the shed, listening to the sounds of celebration that seemed to mock my situation. The laughter was louder now, fueled by champagne and the intoxicating rush of social climbing. My phone buzzed with another message from Margaret. Preliminary files attached. Some very interesting discoveries. Call me when you can talk privately. I opened the attachment and began scrolling through the documents. Property deeds, lease agreements, violation reports, financial records, the digital paper trail of my neighborhood empire. Each document told a story, and together they painted a picture that would have shocked every person at that party. The Ashworths, $15,000 behind on their rent, having spent the money on luxury vacations and status symbols. The Pattersons, numerous. HOA violations for unauthorized exterior modifications, noise complaints from their frequent entertaining, and a pending dispute over their refusal to pay special assessments. The Hendersons, 3 formal complaints about their landscaping crew, damaging common areas, plus an ongoing issue with their pool contractor working without proper permits. And then there was 127 Maple Street, my son's address. The property was purchased through a trust fund I'd established, with the mortgage payments automated through one of my subsidiary companies. David had no idea that his affordable monthly payments were actually being subsidized by his father's wealth. But most interesting of all was a notation I'd never seen before. Tenant requesting lease modification to exclude additional occupants. Cited reasons, social considerations, and space requirements. Melissa had been planning this for months. She'd already approached the property management company, my property management company, about removing me from the lease agreement. The paperwork was sitting in Margaret's office, waiting for landlord approval. My approval. I scrolled through more documents, my understanding of the situation becoming clearer with each page. This wasn't a spontaneous decision brought about by social pressure. This was a calculated campaign to remove me from what she considered her territory. The sound of breaking glass from the house interrupted my reading. Through the window, I could see some commotion on the patio. It looked like someone had knocked over the champagne fountain Melissa had been so concerned about positioning correctly. Her voice cut through the night air, sharp with embarrassment and anger. "Oh my God, be more careful! That fountain cost $3,000. $3,000 for a champagne fountain rental." I happened to know that Elena's catering company charged $800 for fountain rentals, which meant Melissa had been inflating her party expenses to impress her guests. Money that was ultimately coming from the household budget that David thought he was stretching to afford their lifestyle. I closed the files and stood up, brushing dust off my clothes. Through the window, I could see the party was reaching its peak. Guests clustered in animated conversation groups, the catering staff efficiently managing the flow of food and drinks, and Melissa holding court near the patio, clearly in her element. Tomorrow, I decided, would be a very different day for everyone involved. I pulled out my phone one more time and typed a message to Margaret. Schedule a meeting for 8 a.m. sharp. Also, please prepare notices for a comprehensive property inspection of all Maple Street residences. I'll be conducting them personally, starting Monday. After sending the message, I settled back on the milk crate and opened the romance novel Melissa had mentioned. Sunset Passion turned out to be a surprisingly well-written story about a woman who discovers her seemingly powerless situation is actually one of hidden strength. How appropriate. As the party continued outside my shed prison, I found myself planning what would come next. For too long, I'd allowed my desire to remain anonymous to enable the kind of behavior I'd witnessed tonight. But anonymity, I was beginning to realize, was just another form of power, one that was most effective when strategically abandoned. The rain had started again, pattering against the shed roof like a gentle percussion section accompanying the symphony of social climbing happening 30 feet away. Each drop seemed to mark time until the moment when Melissa and her carefully cultivated social circle would discover that their entire world was built on foundations they'd never bothered to examine. I checked my watch. 9:30 p.m. Still hours to go before the party ended, hours more of exile in my own backyard. But I found I didn't mind anymore. The shed had become my command center, the place where I would plan the first strategic moves in what was about to become a very different kind of social event. Tomorrow morning, Harold Jenkins, the inconvenient father-in-law, would begin his transformation, back into Harold Jenkins, the man who owned everything they thought they knew about their privileged lives. The thought brought a smile to my face as I turned the page of my romance novel and settled in to wait for the perfect moment to emerge from the shadows. I woke at 5:30 a.m. in the garden shed, my neck stiff from sleeping on the old recliner I'd dragged in from the garage. Through the window, I could see the aftermath of Melissa's triumph scattered across my perfectly manicured lawn. Champagne flutes abandoned on patio tables, flower petals trampled into the grass, and what appeared to be a designer shoe lying forlorn by the fountain. The house was dark and silent. No doubt Melissa and David were sleeping off their celebration, blissfully unaware that their world was about to shift on its axis. My phone showed 17 missed calls from Margaret Chen and a string of urgent text messages. The last one, sent at 11:47 p.m., simply read, "Emergency, call immediately." I stepped outside the shed, breathing in the cool morning air that still carried hints of expensive perfume and catered appetizers. The party debris looked even more extensive in daylight, evidence of an evening that had cost more than most people earned in a month, all to impress people who were ultimately paying rent to the man they'd relegated to garden storage. Margaret answered on the first ring. "Harold, thank God. We have a situation." "What kind of situation?" "The kind that involves 3 police reports, 1 hospitalization, and a very angry insurance adjuster." Margaret's voice carried the strain of someone who'd been up all night, managing crises. "Your daughter-in-law's party made quite an impression on the neighborhood." I walked to the front of the property, surveying the street. 2 houses down, I could see police tape fluttering around the Hendersons' driveway. Across the street, the Ashworths' pristine lawn was marked with deep tire tracks, and broken glass glittered on their walkway. "Tell me everything," I said, settling. Onto the front porch swing, another amenity I'd installed for David's comfort. Around midnight, things got out of hand. Apparently, some of the guests decided to continue the party by touring the neighborhood. Mrs. Patterson led a group to the Hendersons' house, claiming she wanted to show off their recent renovations. Problem is, the Hendersons weren't home. Closed my eyes, already seeing where this was heading. They broke in? Worse. Mrs. Patterson had a key. Apparently, the Hendersons had given her one for emergency purposes during their vacation last month. She used it to give unauthorized tours of their house to half the party guests. The implications were staggering. Victoria Patterson, the self-appointed queen of Willowbrook Estates, had essentially burglarized one of my properties while hosting an impromptu social event for Melissa's guests. The Hendersons came home around 1 a.m. to find strangers drinking their wine and taking selfies in their master bedroom, Margaret continued. Mr. Henderson called the police. Mrs. Henderson called our emergency line, screaming about eviction, procedures, and the hospitalization. Richard Ashworth. During the chaos at the Hendersons, he fell down their front steps and broke his ankle. But here's the interesting part. He was carrying a bag full of items from their house. Apparently, Mrs. Patterson had been encouraging people to borrow things as souvenirs. I stood up abruptly, pacing the length of the porch. This wasn't just a party gone wrong. This was organized theft, breaking and entering, and property damage across multiple units I owned. The insurance adjuster. 3 separate claims filed before dawn. Property damage, theft, personal injury. All connected to last night's festivities. And Harold? Margaret's voice dropped lower. There's something else. I pulled the security, footage from the common areas. Every street in Willowbrook Estates was monitored by discrete security cameras, a safety feature I'd installed that doubled as property protection. The footage would show everything. How bad is it? Bad enough? That I've already called our legal team. We have clear evidence of criminal activity, property damage, and what appears to be conspiracy to commit theft, all perpetrated by tenants against other tenants on your property. I looked toward the house where my son and daughter-in-law were, sleeping, oblivious to the legal tornado heading their way. The party that was supposed to launch Melissa into Willowbrook's social elite had instead created a criminal case that would make headlines. I'm coming in, I said. Have everything ready for a 7 a.m. meeting. Harold, there's one more thing. Mrs. Patterson called our office at 3 a.m. She was demanding to speak to the property owner about inferior tenants ruining her social event. She wants the Hendersons evicted for hosting inappropriate confrontations. The audacity was breathtaking. Victoria Patterson wanted me to evict tenants for being burglarized at her direction. Did you tell her the owner would be in touch? I told her the owner would be conducting personal property inspections starting Monday. She seemed quite pleased about that, said it was time for proper management oversight. I smiled grimly. Mrs. Patterson was about to get exactly the oversight she'd requested. By 6:30 a.m. I was showered, dressed in my best suit, and standing in the marble lobby of Jenkins Development Group headquarters. The building was a testament to 4 decades of careful planning and strategic growth, 37 floors of prime downtown real estate that I'd developed and still owned outright. Margaret met me at the executive elevator, her arms full of files and her expression grim. Legal is already here. They want to discuss criminal charges before we proceed with any evictions. The elevator rose silently to the 37th floor, where my private office occupied the entire northeast corner of the building. Through floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the sprawling suburbs that had grown around my original developments, including the distant green spaces of Willowbrook Estates. Show me the footage first, I said, settling behind my desk. The security videos played out like a crime documentary. At 11:45 p.m., I watched Victoria Patterson stumble slightly as she led a group of 8 party guests down Maple Street. At 11:52 p.m., she produced a key and opened the Hendersons' front door, gesturing grandly as she invited the group inside. For the next hour and 17 minutes, the cameras captured a steady stream of party guests entering and leaving the Henderson property. Some carried wine bottles. Others emerged with what appeared to be decorative items, books, even clothing. Mrs. Patterson stood in the doorway like a gracious hostess, accepting compliments on her hospitality. Pause it there, I said, pointing to a timestamp of 12:43. On screen, Melissa was clearly visible emerging from the Henderson house carrying what appeared to be a silver picture frame and a small vase. My daughter-in-law, the woman who'd exiled me to a garden shed for being an embarrassment, was participating in organized theft of my tenant's property. The Hendersons are pressing charges, Margaret reported. They want everyone involved prosecuted, to the fullest extent of the law. I fast-forwarded to the moment when the Hendersons returned home. The footage showed their car pulling into the driveway, then both of them standing in their doorway in shocked silence before Mr. Henderson pulled out his phone. And our legal exposure? Significant. As property owner, we could face civil suits for inadequate security, failure to protect tenants, and negligent oversight of common areas. The insurance companies are already asking hard questions about why we allowed this to happen. I turned to face the windows, looking out over the city I'd helped build. Somewhere out there, my son was waking up in a house he didn't know I owned, married to a woman who'd just committed multiple felonies while celebrating her social success. "What are you thinking?" Margaret asked quietly. "I'm thinking it's time to stop being invisible," I said, turning back to my desk. "Call Mrs. Patterson. Tell her the property owner will meet with her at 2 p.m. today to discuss the situation personally. And the others?" "Individual meetings scheduled throughout the week. I want to look each of them in the eye when they realize who they're dealing with." Margaret made notes rapidly. "Should I prepare eviction notices?" "Not yet. First, I want to understand exactly how deep this goes. Mrs. Patterson didn't organize last night's activities alone. She had help, encouragement, and participation from multiple tenants. I want to know who knew what and when." My phone buzzed with a text from David. "Dad, hope you slept okay in the shed. Melissa's making brunch for everyone. Maybe you could eat in the kitchen while we use the dining room. Don't want to crowd the guests who stayed over." Guests who stayed over? In my house, without permission, after participating in criminal activities. Showed the message to Margaret, who shook her head in disbelief. "Your son has no idea, does he?" "None whatsoever, and that's about to change." I typed back, "Won't be joining for brunch. Have some property business to attend to. We'll talk later." The response came quickly. "Property business? Dad, you don't own any property. But okay, see you tonight." I stared at that message for a long moment. My own son, the beneficiary of my decades of work, living in a house I'd purchased for him, surrounded by a community I'd built from nothing, believed I owned nothing at all. "Margaret, I want you to prepare a complete dossier on every resident of Maple Street. Financial records, lease agreements, payment histories, violation reports, criminal background checks, everything. That's a lot of people, Harold. Then, we better get started. Because by the end of this week, every single one of them is going to know exactly who Harold Jenkins really is." The morning flew by in a blur of legal consultations, insurance calls, and strategic planning. By noon, I had a clear picture of my options and a detailed plan for implementing them. At 1:45 p.m., I walked into the Willowbrook Estates clubhouse for my meeting with Victoria Patterson. The clubhouse was another of my properties, a carefully designed community center that provided meeting spaces, recreational facilities, and event hosting for neighborhood residents. Mrs. Patterson arrived precisely on time, dressed in what appeared to be designer business attire and carrying herself with the imperious bearing of someone accustomed to getting their way. She clearly expected to meet with a property manager or junior executive, someone she could intimidate or manipulate. Instead, she found me sitting alone at the conference table, wearing a perfectly tailored suit and the quiet confidence that comes from owning everything in sight. "I'm sorry," she said, pausing in the doorway. "I think there's been a mistake. I'm here to meet with the property owner about last night's unpleasantness." "No mistake, Mrs. Patterson. Please have a seat." She remained standing, confusion evident on her face. "I don't understand. You're Harold Jenkins. You're David's father. You live in that little house at the end of the street." "I am Harold Jenkins," I confirmed, gesturing again to the chair across from me. "And you are Mrs. Victoria Patterson, currently residing at 15 Oak Ridge Drive, under a month-to-month lease agreement that's up for renewal next week." The color drained from her face as the implications hit her. She sank into the offered chair, her perfect composure cracking like ice in spring. You're the owner? Of Willowbrook Estates? Every house, every street, every blade of grass, I said quietly. Including your residence, Mrs. Patterson. Which brings us to last night's festivities. I opened the file Margaret had prepared and slid a series of photographs across the table. Security camera stills showing her breaking into the Henderson property, directing theft, and organizing what amounted to a criminal conspiracy. "This is impossible," she whispered, staring at the images. "You can't be... you're just..." "Just what, Mrs. Patterson? Just the man you've been treating as a social inferior for 4 years? Just the inconvenient father-in-law your friend Melissa exiled to a garden shed?" Her mouth opened and closed soundlessly as she tried to process the reversal of everything. She thought she knew about the neighborhood hierarchy. "The Hendersons are pressing charges," I continued calmly. "Breaking and entering, organized theft, criminal conspiracy. The district attorney is very interested in what appears to be a sophisticated criminal operation targeting multiple properties. We didn't mean... It was just a party that got out of hand. A party where you used an illegally obtained key to break into another family's home, then encouraged 8 people to steal their belongings while you acted as lookout." I slid another document across the table, her lease agreement. "Your monthly rent is currently $4,200. You're also 3 months behind on HOA fees and have 17 documented violations of neighborhood guidelines. Under normal circumstances, this would result in immediate eviction. Please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I had no idea you were... I never would have..." "Never would have what? Organized criminal activities? Or simply never? Would have treated me with such contempt if you'd known I could destroy your life with a phone call?" She stared at the lease agreement, her hands trembling slightly. "What do you want?" "I want you to understand something, Mrs. Patterson. For 4 years, you've lived in my property, used my facilities, and benefited from my investment in this community. And for 4 years, you've treated me like I was beneath your notice." Stood up, walking to the window that overlooked the street where she lived. "Last night, you crossed a line. You didn't just disrespect me. You committed crimes against other tenants, damaged my property, and exposed me to massive legal liability. I'll pay for everything," she said quickly. "All the damages, the stolen items, whatever it costs." The stolen items include a silver picture frame worth $800 and a crystal vase valued at $1,200. The property damage extends to 3 separate units. The legal exposure could reach 6 figures. I turned back to face her, noting how small she looked in the expensive chair. "But that's not really the issue, is it, Mrs. Patterson? The issue is that you organized a criminal conspiracy because you felt entitled to treat other people's property as your personal playground." She nodded miserably, apparently unable to speak. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, returning to my seat. "You're going to personally apologize to the Hendersons. You're going to return every stolen item and pay for all damages. You're going to cooperate fully with the police investigation. And then you're going to move out of Willowbrook Estates. I'm not renewing your lease." The words hit her like a physical blow. She doubled over slightly, as if I'd punched her in the stomach. "This is my home," she whispered. "I've lived here for 6 years. My whole life is here. Your whole life was built on treating other people poorly because you thought you were untouchable. Last night proved you were wrong." I closed her file and stood up. "You have 30 days, Mrs. Patterson. I suggest you use them wisely." As I walked toward the door, she called after me. "What about the others? The people who were with me? They'll each have their own conversations with me this week. But I suspect their outcomes will depend largely on how they choose to handle their situations. And Melissa? Your son's wife?" I paused in the doorway, considering the question. "Melissa will discover that actions have consequences, regardless of family relationships." That evening, I sat in the garden shed one final time, watching through the window as David and Melissa cleaned up the last remnants of her party. They moved quietly, efficiently, with none of the celebratory energy from the night before. My phone had been ringing all afternoon, Margaret with updates on legal proceedings, insurance adjusters requesting documentation, and increasingly frantic, calls from various Willowbrook residents who'd begun to hear rumors about the morning's meeting with Mrs. Patterson. David approached the shed around sunset, his expression troubled. "Dad, we need to talk." I opened the door, noting the way he fidgeted with his wedding ring, a nervous habit he'd developed over the past year. "Mrs. Patterson called Melissa this afternoon," he said. "She was crying, talking about being evicted, saying something about you owning the whole neighborhood. That's crazy, right? I mean, you'd have told us if you owned our house." I looked at my son, my successful, intelligent son who'd never questioned how he'd been able to afford a house in Willowbrook Estates on his middle management salary. "David, sit down. There are some things I need to explain." For the next hour, I told him everything. The development company, the shell corporations, the careful planning that had transformed farmland into one of the county's most desirable addresses. His face cycled through disbelief, shock, anger, and finally a kind of numb acceptance. "So this house is yours," I said firmly. "I bought it for you because I wanted you to have the life I never had growing up. But I did it anonymously because I wanted you to value it, to take pride in what you thought you'd achieved yourself. And Melissa doesn't know. Melissa will find out tomorrow when she meets with Margaret Chen to discuss her participation in last night's criminal activities." David was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands. Finally, he looked up at me with eyes that held a mixture of gratitude and shame. "Dad, about last night, about the shed, I'm so sorry. If you'd known I owned the property, you would have treated me differently. But that's not the point, David. The point is that I'm your father, and I deserved basic respect. Regardless of what I owned," he nodded slowly. "You're right. Melissa was wrong, and I was wrong for letting it happen." A week later, the neighborhood had been transformed. Mrs. Patterson's house stood empty, a "for rent" sign marking her rapid departure. The Ashworths had quietly moved out after failing to make restitution for their participation in the theft. 3 other families involved in the incident had relocated rather than face the ongoing legal proceedings. Melissa had survived her meeting with Margaret, but barely. The criminal charges were dropped in exchange for full restitution and community service, but the social consequences were devastating. Her dreams of joining the Willowbrook Wives Club died when most of its members were evicted or chose to leave the neighborhood entirely. David and I had begun rebuilding our relationship on a foundation of honesty rather than hidden generosity. He'd insisted on paying market-rate rent for the house, and I'd insisted on treating him like the capable adult he was rather than the child I'd been protecting. The garden shed had been converted into my home office, a place where I could work on property management issues while staying close to my son's family. It was comfortable, private, and symbolic of how the most powerful position is often the one that appears weakest to those who don't understand what they're looking at. One evening, as I sat in my shed office reviewing plans for a new development project, Melissa knocked on the door. She looked tired, humbled, and genuinely remorseful. "Harold, I owe you an apology. A real one." I gestured for her to sit down, noting how different she seemed from the imperious hostess who'd banished me to this same space weeks earlier. "I was horrible to you. Not just that night, but for months before. I was so focused on fitting in, on being someone important, that I forgot what actually matters. And what's that? Family. Respect. Being grateful for what you have instead of always wanting more." She was quiet for a moment, then smiled ruefully. "David told me about the house, about everything you've done for us. I don't deserve it." "It's not about deserving, Melissa. It's about family, taking care of family. Can we start over? she asked. I know I can't undo what I did, but I'd like to try to be the daughter-in-law you deserve. I looked at this young woman who'd caused so much pain and created so much chaos, and saw something I hadn't expected: genuine remorse and a willingness to change. I'd like that, I said. But no more parties in the garden shed? She laughed. The first genuine laugh I'd heard from her in months. Deal, though I have to ask, what's it like owning everything? I thought about the question seriously. It's like being responsible for everything. Every decision affects real people's lives. Every choice has consequences that ripple through the community. Is that why you stayed hidden for so long? I stayed hidden because I thought anonymity would protect me from people who wanted things from me. What I learned is that anonymity can also protect people who treat others poorly. I gestured toward the window, where the lights of Willowbrook estates twinkled in the gathering darkness. Sometimes the best way to use power is to step out of the shadows and let people know exactly who they're dealing with. 6 months later, the Willowbrook Wives Club was a memory, replaced by a genuine community organization that focused on neighborhood improvement rather than social exclusion. The property values had actually increased as word spread about the comprehensive reforms and community-focused management, and I was no longer the invisible landlord or the inconvenient father-in-law. I was Harold Jenkins, developer, community leader, and proud grandfather to David and Melissa's newborn daughter, who would grow up in the neighborhood her grandfather built from nothing but empty fields and impossible dreams. The garden shed remained my office, but now it was a symbol of choice rather than exile. Because sometimes the most powerful position isn't the biggest office or the most impressive title. It's the quiet corner where you can see everything clearly and make the decisions that matter most. After all, true power isn't about demanding respect. It's about earning it, one choice at a time, even when nobody knows you have it to give. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.